I love my kids. I tell myself that a lot because there are days where it can be difficult as a parent. And one of my prayers when we were pregnant with our youngest Joy was that she would be someone who knows who she is, would be confident and self-sufficient. Mainly because I was a youth pastor for many years and I saw firsthand all the drama that comes with dating relationships in teenagers. And my prayer was and still is that Joy will know who she is in Jesus and won't put up with guys trying to woo her away. And I believe God has and is answering that prayer. And I tell myself, Mark, you're playing the long game. But I didn't realize that a confident, self-sufficient young woman first starts as a confident, strong-willed child. I'll tell you, I didn't see that one coming at all. She gives us a run for our money on a daily basis. And she's that type of kid that can just say no to whatever it is you're asking her to do. And then on top of that, take whatever threats or things you want to throw at her in stride. So I often find myself going from zero to nuclear and I've got nowhere else to go and I have no idea what I'm going to do. And with this confident, self-sufficient personality comes strong feelings when it comes to everything. There is no gray area with Joy. Something is either the best or the worst. She either loves something or hates something. It's all or it's nothing. And that can all happen within the span of one day. Like there is no middle ground, just sharp contrasts. And sharp contrasts would be a great way to describe the letter to the church we'll be reading about today. And we're continuing in our series, Dear Church, looking at letters written from Jesus to 7 cities in the book of Revelation. And these were across Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And you may have noticed as we look at this map that we've kind of jumped a bit out of order from how the letters were written. And that's on purpose. We first looked at Ephesus and Pergamos or Pergamum and Thyatira. These 3 churches were all both praised and corrected by Jesus. And last week specifically, we read about how Jesus warned the church in Thyatira to be careful of who or what you tolerate. And he told them to hold fast to him above all else, to continue growing in love and faith and service and patient endurance. And now today we're going to look at Smyrna, which was one of the 2 churches that only received praise from Jesus. And Smyrna, which is it's a fun word to say, was a church facing immense persecution. And our big idea today, if I could sum it up, is this: Jesus helps us to endure hardship. Jesus helps us to endure hardship. And we'll be reading in Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. But before we jump in, let's give some quick context on the city of Smyrna. Like Ephesus, this was another prominent port city. And I've got a picture here that shows that city. And along with many of the cities we've seen so far, they had a very strong presence of the imperial cult, which is essentially extreme devotion, even worship of the Roman emperor. And this will prove to be a problem for the followers of Jesus in Smyrna. But on top of that, Smyrna also had a strong Jewish community. And many early Christians were Jewish. And when they became followers of Jesus, that community essentially pushed them out. So this is a world that I guess you say the Smyrnans or Smyrnians are living in. So let's read Jesus' words to this community of believers. We'll start reading in Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. Write this letter to the angel of the church in Smyrna. This is the message from the one who is first and the last, who was dead but is now alive. And just like we discussed last week, we've discussed in previous weeks, the letter to the angel represents this spiritual conversation that Jesus is longing to have with the people of Smyrna. It's kind of like they're overhearing this conversation. And the message is this: it's from the one who is first and the last, and Jesus describes himself then as dead but is now alive. And remember what I mentioned a few minutes ago. This letter could be described as sharp contrasts. And both of these descriptions fit that sharp contrast theme well. Why would Jesus describe himself this way? For a church that is facing immense persecution, these words would have been a source, I believe, of encouragement. Right? The first and the last. Jesus is saying he's above all that they are facing. He encapsulates it all. And then dead but is now alive. I believe he's nothing, not even death could keep Jesus down. He has the power to rescue this struggling church. But these descriptions, as we've seen in previous weeks, also connect to the unique history of the city or the culture of Smyrna. It was the first city to build a temple to Roma, who was the god of Rome, the imperial cult. So that first and the last. Furthermore, centuries before, the city had nearly vanished, but had recovered and become this beautiful, prominent city. which caused some to compare it with the mythical creature, the phoenix. It was a bird that symbolized resurrection, dead but is now alive. So Jesus is speaking specifically to the struggles that this city and this culture are facing. So let's keep reading in Revelation chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they are not, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. The devil will throw some of you into prison to test you. You will suffer for 10 days, but if you remain faithful, even when facing death, I will give you the crown of life. Okay, so this is supposed to be encouragement. Jesus is highlighting or praising the issues this church is facing. He says, I know you're suffering. I know your poverty. I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. This doesn't seem like things to be positive about, right? And they're facing more than just your run-of-the-mill type issues. They are enduring suffering and poverty, and both of these are likely due to their faith in Jesus. Because Smyrna, again, was a center of imperial worship, and the Christians there were facing persecution because they refused to participate in the worship of Caesar. And the minimum requirement of this imperial cult was once a year that every citizen would burn incense to Caesar and say, Caesar is Lord. But the Christians refused to do this because they knew that Jesus alone was Lord, and they were not going to bow down to a pretender. Their allegiance is to Jesus, not Caesar. And part of the challenge that the Christians there were facing was this economic challenge. Because they refused to participate in the imperial cult, they were seen as traitors, and they couldn't work freely. And Jesus sees their poverty, he sees their work, and while they are economically poor, Jesus is reminding them of their true wealth. It's not money or possessions. Their great wealth is their relationship with Jesus, being part of the family of God. Yet in the midst of these struggles, we see another, again, standout in this passage is something I referred to earlier, right? These stark contrasts, that theme of stark contrasts. He says, I know you're suffering in your poverty, but what? You're rich. Those blaspheming against you claim to be Jews, but they're not. And then we see they don't have a synagogue of God, but one of Satan. Stark contrasts or paradoxes are fundamental in faith. And the gospel message itself is a paradox. Jesus said, if you want to find your life, you should what? Like it to the fullest? No. You should what? Lose it. He said, whoever wants to be the greatest should what? Push themselves to the front of the line? No. Be a servant. We could go on like this for days. But the greatest contrast is the gospel message itself. The fact that God would lower himself, take on the form of his creation in Jesus, would give his life as a sacrifice for our sins, and through death and resurrection, bring out this amazing new birth reversal. See, Jesus is the first in God's inbreaking new birth kingdom. And the Apostle Paul talks about some of this stark contrast, some of the paradox within the gospel, and he's writing to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 1, verses 23 and 24. So when we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. But to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. He's saying, listen, if this gospel message is nonsense to the Gentiles, and it's an offense to the Jews. And that's exactly where the church in Smyrna found themselves in this letter. They're misunderstood by the wider culture around them, and then on top of that, they're being actively persecuted by the Jews. And Jesus is saying, where does this persecution come from? He describes it this way, the synagogue of Satan. What does that mean? What was probably happening at this time was the Jewish community was not just turning their backs on these followers of Jesus, these maybe family or friends that used to be part of their community, but they may have also been turning them in, thinking they were doing God's work for again, not pledging allegiance to Caesar. And following Jesus was a risk for people because they could have lost their jobs and security, but also could have lost their family. And we shouldn't imagine, we think of the Jewish synagogue, and the church, kind of having one in each corner and throughout the city as we see today. We should imagine a Jewish community of several thousand that's well established. It's got its own buildings and community life. And then on the flip side, we've got the church, probably maybe 2 or 3 dozen people at most, holding on to this highly improbable and extremely risky claim that the God of Israel has raised Jesus from the dead. The church in Smyrna was under fire, and they were completely outnumbered. And what encouragement does Jesus have for these persecuted Christians? He's saying, what is he saying? Don't be afraid. There's more persecution coming. Some of you will be thrown into prison for a time. But if you remain faithful even to death, the promise is what? You will receive a crown of life. And listen, that encouragement doesn't sound very encouraging, right? This is a time of testing. He's saying, hang on, endure. And it reminds me of when you go to the dentist to get some work done on your teeth. And the dentist, have you ever had the dentist say this dreaded line? You're going to feel some pressure. And if you haven't, listen, that's code language for pain. You're going to feel some pressure. This is going to hurt a bit. And that's what we see happening here. There's pressure, there's persecution being applied. And the amazing thing about pressure is that when it's applied, what's in you is what is going to come out of you. And I've got, this picture here of a juicer. And this is a lemon. And what do you think if you put pressure on this lemon? What do you think is going to come out of this lemon? Orange juice? Grape juice? No, right? Lemon juice is going to come out of this lemon. When you put pressure on a lemon, what's going to come out of it is what's in it, lemon juice. And that's the same thing in our lives. When life throws its worst at us, what is in us is what will come out of us. And Jesus is encouraging the church in Smyrna to endure, to hang on to him. And the end result, he says, will be a crown of life. He says, death and sin will not have the final word. And that idea, that crown of life, when the city of Smyrna, when it was viewed from a distance, it looked like a crown resting sort of on the summit of this hill. So again, we see that when Jesus is using some of this metaphor, this picture language, he's speaking directly to this city and this culture. So again, like we've said earlier, notice there's no correction in this letter like we've seen in the past few weeks. And when you're facing pressure, you don't need advice, you need hope. And that's exactly what Jesus gives them here. Listen to how this letter ends in Revelation chapter 2, verse 11. Anyone with ears to hear must listen to the Spirit and understand what he is saying to the churches. Again, this is important. If you are a Jesus person, this is something you want to catch. Whoever is victorious will not be harmed by the second death. We can endure hardship because we already know the end of the story, right? Jesus wins. Death will not have the final say. Didn't have the final say in his story, and therefore won't have the final say in our story. And does that make the struggles that we face in this life any easier? No. But it makes it possible. Because we have eyes to see more than just what's in front of us, right? We have this eternal perspective, right? That we know death is not the end of our story. And as the writer of Hebrews describes in Hebrews 12:3, he says this about Jesus. It says, for the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross. Right? His joy is what allowed him to endure the cross. He had his eyes on the situation. He had his eyes on the future, right? On what was eternal. And our hope in Jesus brings hope into the hardships we face. And furthermore, as we looked at with the lemon, when we face hardship, right, when pressure comes, what's in us is what's going to come out of us. And my hope and prayer is that Jesus gets the glory. That when we make much of him, that we would make much of him in whatever we face. And I want to close in sharing the story of actually one of the influential leaders in the city, in the church of Smyrna. And his name is Polycarp, which is a fun name. We're just doing a lot of fun names today. But he was a personal disciple of the Apostle John, which is amazing. And he was the bishop of this church in Smyrna some 50 years after this letter. And we believe tradition says he was martyred around 155 AD. And his story was influential, even among the wider culture. Just as Jesus promised, persecution against the Christians in Smyrna continued to come. And in fact, at one point, it reached a fever pitch. They were being thrown into prison. They were being fed to the wild beasts in the arena. And naturally, Polycarp, as the bishop, as a leader of that church, became a target of this type of persecution. And I wanted to read a bit from a document called the Martyrdom of Polycarp, which was written about his death. It talks about how the authorities sent out a search party to bring him in. And they had tortured 2 slave boys to reveal where Polycarp was being hidden. It was a Friday afternoon. Polycarp was resting upstairs in a country home, and they came in like a posse, fully armed as if they were arresting a dangerous criminal. Polycarp's friends wanted to sneak him out, but he refused, saying, God's will be done. In one of the most touching instances of Christian grace imaginable, Polycarp welcomed his captors as if they were friends. He talked with them and ordered that food and drink be served to them. And then he made one simple request. He said, "Give me 1 hour to pray before you take me away." And the officers, of course, obliged. And overhearing this, which his prayers ended up going on for more like 2 hours, they began to have second thoughts on who it is they were arresting. What were they doing arresting an old man who was in his 80s at this point? And despite the cries of the crowd as he was brought into the arena, the Roman authorities saw the senselessness of making this aged man a martyr. And so when Polycarp was again brought in before the proconsul or the leader of that area, he told him, "Curse Christ and I will release you." And Polycarp replied, "86 years I have served him," meaning Jesus. "He had never done me wrong. How can I then blaspheme my king who has saved me?" The proconsul reached for an acceptable way out. He says, "Listen, just do this. Just swear by the spirit of the emperor, and that will be enough." Basically, offer worship to the emperor, claim that he is Lord, give allegiance to him, and that's enough. And Polycarp said this: "If you imagine for a moment that I will do that, then I think you pretend that you don't. I think you pretend that you don't know who I am. Hear it plainly. I am a Christian." And after going back and forth with this proconsul, the verdict was reached that Polycarp would be burned at the stake. And his response to this was this: "You threaten fire that burns for an hour and is over, but the judgment on the ungodly is forever." Hardcore stuff, right? So the fire was prepared. Polycarp, as he was being prepared to be burned, he lifted his eyes to heaven and prayed, "Father, I bless you that you have deemed me worthy of this day and hour, that I might take a portion of the martyrs in the cup of Christ. Among these may I today be welcomed before thy face as a rich and acceptable sacrifice." And this is kind of weird, okay? I'm just going to tell you that now. But as the fire engulfed him, the believers noted that the smell was not, again, it's kind of graphic, of burning flesh, but it said as baking bread, or as gold and silver refined in a furnace. And I just again, I wanted to share this story because it's a real story that ties into what Jesus has told this church. And again, we see someone who is enduring for their faith, enduring and saying, "Jesus, I'm going to hold on to you in the face of persecution." And granted, that persecution ended in his death. But even in that, right, what was in him is what came out of him. Jesus was honored. Jesus was glorified in his death. And I'm not saying that is what we should expect. That's not what I'm saying. But I want us to remember this. We have a real enemy that will come against us as we press forward in what God is calling us to as a church. We're going to face hardship, and opposition shouldn't discourage us. It means we have the enemy on notice. And we want to endure, keep our eyes on Jesus. And as I think about some next steps for us as we wrestle with this letter, the first thing I want us to remember is this: again, endure hardship when it comes. I know there's lots of examples of ways that we are facing hardship as a church. I know there are many within our church that are facing health hardships. Maybe there are some of you that are facing financial hardships, or maybe a conflict with family, friends, or coworkers. Maybe you've had a dream that you've had, or something you've been working for that just isn't going forward. It's been taken away from you, or maybe over COVID, or maybe you're facing pressure to compromise your faith at home or at work. Remember Jesus' encouragement to this church and to us: endure. Endure. Don't be afraid. He's with you. And he promises life beyond anything in this world. And the second thing I want us to reflect on is this: is pray for the persecuted church. One of the things that a passage like this should bring to mind is that we have brothers and sisters around the world who are facing persecution because of their faith in Jesus. And while we can't personally help all of these brothers and sisters, we can pray. So I would invite us to pray for the persecuted church. And I've got a website here, icommittopray.com. And this is a page put on by Voice of the Martyrs, which notes different places around the world where Christians are under persecution and how we can be praying for them. And lastly, I just want to give one last next step, and that is become a follower of Jesus. As we talk about the paradox, right, of the gospel, how Jesus laid down his life so that we could find life. And maybe you've tried to find life at all sorts of things around you. You've pursued the world. You've pursued things. You've placed your hope in people, in dreams or ideals and things, and they've let you down. And ultimately, you wonder, is there any hope in this life? Maybe as you face hardship, you say, well, what's the point? And Jesus has come to rescue you. He's come to give you hope. He's come to give you life. And it starts as we surrender to him and say, Jesus, I give you all that I am. Jesus, I find my life in you. Forgive me. Make me new. And I know he answers that prayer every time we pray that. And so, Oasis, I just want to encourage us as a church, as we move forward in what Jesus has called us to, there's going to be opportunities for us to endure. There's going to be opportunities of pressure, times of pressure and testing. Right? As we go into this vision that God has given us, the enemy is going to want to push back on this. Remember, when we're facing pressure, what's in us is what's going to come out of us. Let that be the fruit of the Spirit. Let that be Jesus at work in us and through us. And let's keep our eyes fixed on him. God bless Oasis.